I'm a researcher at the University of Barcelona, and I also teach in the International University of Catalonia in the Architecture and Urban Planning School. So my talk today, I have to warn you, is a bit of a mess, in the sense that I'm trying to fit everything together, not necessarily everything that I study, but a little bit bringing together all of the different currents of thought and of research that have been discussed and have been presented at the school. So I try to bring in a little bit case studies from the global north, from the south, from rural and urban areas, even though I have to admit that for this particular talk, which is based on two things. It's based on a paper that Joan Martinez-Ali and I wrote this winter called Revisiting the Environmentalism of the Poor, his seminal book, and it's also based on my own research and some of the interpretation of the literature in urban geography and urban sociology. So it's called Revisiting the Environmentalism of the Poor, Territory and Place in Disconnected Global Struggles. And so the emphasis of the talk is really on the importance of territory, land, and place in different forms of environmentalism of the poor, of environmental justice struggles. So our paper originally was based on the fact that I had just arrived at the UAB after finishing my PhD in the US in 2011, and so we started to think about different ways of collaborating and of mixing our thoughts and our line of research together, Joan and I. And so the idea was to look at a revised framework of the environmentalism of the poor, taking into consideration the book, which was a seminal book that presented three varieties of environmentalism, which I will briefly remind you all about in a few minutes. And it was a book that was really dissecting their origins, their discourses, their strategies, but it did have, as Joan himself said, a more rural or agrarian basis, which the talk today tries to address a little bit. It's also based on the fact that between the time that the book was published in 2002 and 2012 and now 2013, there's been an explosion, or at least an explosion of reports on environmental conflicts in the world, and also of resistance movements and alliances and organizations created around environment and exploitation of resources. And at the same time, there is not really an umbrella organization that brings those claims, those fights together. And so at least maybe our possible contribution as researchers was to think about the way that we could bring those different movements together and thinking about them in a common framework. And also what we noticed, which is also part of my own research, is the importance that the idea of territory, place, and placemaking relationally to identity has in those environmental justice struggles, which is why we wanted to look more in depth at these new forms, let's say, of environmental justice struggle. So what was the problem? What was the research question that we were trying to address? Was really around, in the multiplicity of local environmental struggles around the world, how do activists define, represent, and use place, culture, and tradition? And I will give you some examples of conflicts, and also what type of forces, what type of broader political economy schemes are they fighting so that they could really reassert their values, their cultures, and their sense-making about place. So what this paper is about, but also in a way my research, is looking at the recent evolution of the environmental justice agendas, claims, and discourses with an emphasis on the urban for this talk. And the main thesis here that I'm trying to advance is the fact that contestation in environmental justice struggle is a way to reassert, is a tool used to reassert traditional practices, protect land from contamination, dumping, but also private appropriation and real estate speculation, which is, for me, also the way that you link rural and urban research together, trying to really conceptualize what is the land and the resources on the land, and what we produce on this land, which also has an impact on the air, like I'm thinking about the previous talk we just had about the commons also being the air above us, how this has also an impact. And the implications here of this talk, either for environmental justice research or for activism, is to really bring back in the idea of land and place centrally, and think about it away from land being an object of speculation, control, competition, and rent. So just very briefly, I'm sure the wide majority of you, or you should know, these three forms of environmentalism that the environmentalism of the poor describe. The first part is more what conservation biology has been studying, and also traditional international organizations like WWF or IUCN have been working on, which is what Joanne called the cult of wilderness. The idea that you have to enclose endangered natural areas together with their species in them to support their reproduction through time and to really protect them from disappearing. However, the evolution that we've seen in the past 10 years is that this current of environmentalism has been more and more drawn to an economic language, which brings it closer to the second current, which is something that Joanne calls the gospel of eco-efficiency. And the idea there is that there's more and more valuation of land as an economic resource also, and in a way the natural resources that are there can be protected through schemes that encourage the people on the ground to really preserve them in a more sustainable way. So this gospel of eco-efficiency has to do very much with the concept of sustainable development, which appeared very clearly in the Brundtland report in 1987, but then kind of took different forms of denominations, appropriations, through maybe the idea of smart growth, smart cities, for instance, and that really proves the importance of ecological modernization in the way that if we use resources wisely, if we also take full benefits of technology, then maybe we are not all going to go under. And the resources that we manage won't go under either. And of course, this gospel of eco-efficiency is linked to a critique that we see towards how ecosystem services are being more and more commodified, rather than just thought as services per se. So that's are the two first forms of environmentalism, and then the third form of environmentalism, which this talk is more focused on, is the environmentalism of the poor, the mantra of environmental justice, where the environment is mostly analyzed in relationship to the people that are dependent on it for their livelihoods, for their survival, for their cultural identity, and also the environment, which is also an object of inequality, imposition of different forms of burden upon people, either in forms of resource extraction or contamination. So I'll just go very briefly into this. And by the way, my talk has a lot of little citations, and it's because, this is also a summer school, so it's a way maybe for you also to help with some of you guys' literature reviews or whatever forms of reference you might be looking for. So bear with the amount of citations there are through the talks. It's meant to be also kind of a pedagogical resource in the future. So, we all know from the literature, the very wide literature in environmental sociology, in epidemiology, in geography, about the disproportionate exposure of poor people, of communities of color, in regards to environmental toxics, to refineries, to oil extraction, to dumping, to waste sites, to pesticides, to also contaminants in the workplace. So as Stefania Barca always reminds us, we must not forget the workplace. So when we think about places like the Silicon Valley in California, a lot of Chinese American workers or Mexican American workers are exposed to very toxic chemicals as they manipulate chips that we all use in our beautiful MacBooks or Samsung computers. So environmental justice also is very present at the workplace. It is also, environmental inequities are also exacerbated by the fact that policies around environmental protection have benefited them less. There hasn't been enough monitoring, there hasn't been enough forms of protection in regards to the health of these communities in comparison with more privileged areas. And finally, what I want to emphasize here is that we seem to consider a lot that the environmental justice literature kind of started in the United States and then in a way expanded a lot in the global south. But we also forget that there's been also a lot of studies on air pollution, on unequal exposure in Northern Europe, in Southern Europe as well, and Mikel Ortega, who I won't see here, but he was one of the first researchers who also did a really good statistical study of unequal exposure in Catalonia and in Catalonian urban regions. However, and that's where I guess the work of political ecologists comes in, there has been a lot of community voices around environmental bad, and I call them voluntarily environmental bad because also afterwards, because of the, let's say, positive switch that those communities have made in the last 10 to 15 years. So originally, environmental justice fights, as you know, were rooted in the civil rights movement in the United States, very much into the highway, anti-highway construction movement. In places like Boston or in places like San Francisco, entire highways would wipe out marginalized neighborhoods such as Jamaica Plain in Boston or in New Orleans, in the neighborhood of Tremé, and really transform and shape those communities differently where the highway would be in the middle of residential areas. So the movement started there, and there have been thousands of fights that have been documented in the literature about the way that people resist dumping and contamination. And I think this is a really important form of contribution, which in a way, even though sometimes there are qualitative forms of research of resistance, they kind of put together almost like a statistical database of all of the forms of resistance. But I do think that as political ecology researchers, our goal is really to go beyond, just thinking about us as studying resistance, but also what is particular in the forms of resistance that emerge, what are the broader political economy processes that are creating those forms of resistance. There have been some successful policy and legal efforts to support the plight of communities. For instance, in the United States, the Executive Order 12898, signed by President Clinton in 1994, as well as victories all over the place. And as a result, now there are more than 1,000 organizations that have joined the People of Color Environmental Groups Directory. And the importance here to think about, as also I think we reflect in our own research, is that this directory includes more and more a variety of organizations that originally were not environmental justice organizations. And the main mantra here is that people have a right to play, learn, live, pray in safe and environmentally welcoming places, and that this is indistinctive of race, gender, and class, which means that the environmental justice agenda has really slowly evolved, especially in cities, towards much more holistic forms of thinking about what is a safe and clean environment. So anyway, before moving to these environmental justice agenda in cities, I want to go back to the importance of territory and place in both rural and urban struggles, which is what I think is the way that, and Joanne, we argue that also in the paper, which is really the central point of all of these environmental struggles together. The valuation of territory, the framing of the importance of place and place-making. So just a brief case study from Ecuador, which used to be my research before my PhD and before I switched to a different case site. So in countries like Ecuador, Peru, Malaysia, all of these places that you guys do wonderful research in, the idea of the environmentalism of the poor is that not necessarily people are environmentalists, but because they have a true stake in the natural resources on the ground, they tend to protect the environment, and they think and behave as environmentalists. And they tend to be more frequently on the side of nature rather than on the side of state and corporations around them. So they have not much to do with the eco-efficiency movements or with the cult of wilderness that are the two first currents of environmentalism that Joanne talks about. in this environmentalism of the poor, and particularly in the places I think that you study in rural context, the role of women is really important to emphasize in two ways, because women tend to have more responsibilities in collecting water, in managing animals, in producing crops, in taking care of a lot of responsibilities than men. So oftentimes they have a better understanding of the relationships between humans and nature around them. And also they actually more and more take leadership positions. And that's also something that I think we've seen evolving in the last 10, 15 years of conflicts, is the central role of women are organizers, as speakers, as leaders. We see them oftentimes. You look at pictures of protests in Ecuador, for instance, or marches that go from the Amazon to Quito, and you see women at the forefront of those marches. So indigenous people and the value of place. Sorry, I didn't know to do that. So why are indigenous rights so much at stake when we think about resource extraction and also about the value of place? It's because when you look at the map of environmental conflicts and resource extraction, many of them tend to be, there is a superposition between the indigenous communities and then the blocks, for instance, of oil extraction that you see being given to oil companies, and this is the case of Ecuador. And the important part here to bring it, the value of place, is to really distinguish, in the case of Ecuador, and I would say also of other indigenous countries like Peru and Bolivia, the distinction between tierra and territorio. And territorio here, territory, is the central concept in the sense that it refers to the ancestral land, to the historical land, and also it encompasses the moral, cosmological, and political economic complexes that shape identity and social relationships. You can see that I didn't write that because first it has way too much jargon and maybe it's too well written. Now it is a quote from Susanna Sawyer, and the idea here is that tierra has a really in-depth meaning in the imaginary, in the cosmology, in the way of life of people on the ground. And so when I did my research in Sarayaku in Ecuador, which is a community that has been resisting oil extraction for 20 years, more than that now, they really distinguished three parts of their territory, which for us, let's say, in Western culture, is not something we really necessarily think about. The Hawapacha, which is the sky, the Kaipacha, which is the earth, and the Ucapacha, which is the subsoil. And all of these three parts are independent with each other and are really crucial to the maintenance of traditional activities being either food-related or culture-related. So what Ines Chigango, one of the leaders, said about the importance of territory was, mountains, rivers, cascades, and plains are strength, wisdom, protection, and nutrition given to mankind. We are the earth, and the earth is ours. We don't exist without it. So you can really see that once a company comes in for either prospection or extraction of oil, it breaks through, directly breaks through this cosmology. And so that's why the resistance on the ground has emerged, because people believe that controlling the use of resources and the use of the land is a sine qua non condition to maintain this cosmology and the traditional use of land. And they also have legal instruments like the ILO Convention 169 to protect their identity or people. And the very interesting things here also about the value of place, that place is also used within the development of strategic repertoires of action, in the sense that people call for different forms of deliberative and participatory frames in their relationships with the companies and in their relationships with the government. And for instance, the referendum, it is now a tool that's used a lot, and that some of researchers here in the room, I don't know if Mariana Walter is here, have written papers about the role that these traditional forms of participation has shaped resistance. So more broadly, what does also this indigenous resistance tell us in regards to the way that we have thought in general about, here's my name, about economic growth and economic accumulation. The interesting aspect here, I pointed out very briefly yesterday, is that they have developed, indigenous groups have started to develop different conceptions of the use of land and resources, which is embodied in the poster of Summa Causae, Good Living, which was introduced in the Ecuadorian Constitution in 2008, which really questions economic growth as measured into profit and losses by GDP, which often implies the destruction of natural capital, social capital, human capital, including all the multiple languages that people speak and use in their daily life. Summa Causae also provides an alternative to the uniform transition from underdevelopment to development. And it also shows that increases in happiness doesn't necessarily correlate with with increases in income above a certain level of per capita income. And so I think that the raise of such concepts are really important to bring together the role that indigenous conceptions of land, of place, and of, in a way, survival and livelihood has, and how that shapes resistance on the ground. Okay. So this was one example to illustrate the importance of place, territory, and identity in recent environmental justice struggles. I'm going to move now more to environmental justice struggles, and I'm going to focus here on one main case study in the United States, which has been part of my research for the past 5 years, and also bringing together other themes and other small case studies here and there. So as I was starting to say earlier, the environmental justice agenda in the US has really transformed in the past 20 years, from the struggles of Love Canal, from the different forms of environmental justice summits. And you know, when you talk to activists on the ground, they say, well, we've always been talking about that, but academics have not really picked up on the ways that we really not only fight against an environmental bad, but also for transformation of the neighborhoods of the cities in which we live. And so for me, that actually shows that inequalities in cities are not only manifested in the distribution of environmental bads, where are the waste sites located, where are the refineries located, but also in the distribution of environmental goods. And that's what David Fellow, what environmental sociologist David Fellow calls environmental privilege. So he takes the example of Aspen in Colorado, where he says that different forms of municipal ordinances have shaped who has access to the natural resources in Aspen and who gets excluded, which in this case are the Mexican immigrants that work and produce Aspen as it is an international luxury resort. And so when you bring that together with environmental justice, it really has triggered this idea that there are also inequalities in the distribution of environmental goods, different forms of new agendas put on the ground. There is one that's very important, which is the transit justice, transportation justice agenda. The idea that low-income communities of colors have the right to affordable form of transit, clean transit, not necessarily diesel buses in the middle of the communities, and all of the bus depots that also tend to be located in communities of color. And that's also something embodied in the TRI fights in Los Angeles since the 1990s. There's also the importance of health, fresh and affordable food, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of food deserts, but you know, we tend to think that people are obese, have weight issues because they don't care about their health. But actually, when you look at the spatial organization of many American cities and more cities in Ireland or in the UK, you can see that people are really segregated in also their access to healthy food, to supermarket, to fresh produce. And so there is a lot of agenda in environmental justice groups that has been around bringing back farmers markets, local co-ops, urban farms, but at the big scale, not like just a little garden there symbolically, but really something that's productive and that makes people have control over their land, not only food security, but also food sovereignty. A lot of emphasis also on green, affordable, and healthy housing, the access to recreational and green space for residents next to renovated and rebuilt housing structures, and also all of the new movement for jobs and training in the green economy. So I will pass briefly on that just to basically emphasize the transition of the environmental justice movement what we've been talking about in the past few days, about how do we move from something that is a fight against one specific thing to a different model, a different alternative, in that case of neighborhoods and of cities. So the neighborhood here, I'll present very briefly, is Dudley in Boston. As you can see here, or maybe I don't know if you can see it on the image, but the bottom part of the image is more the residential area of Dudley, which you can see is a mix of housing and green space, and then the upper part is still more industrial uses in the neighborhood. And if you looked at the picture of Dudley 20 years ago, in the beginning of the 30 years ago, the beginning of the 1980s, what you would see would be 1,300 vacant lots. So imagine one of the centrally located neighborhoods where you live, Barcelona, Lund, wherever, where in the middle of the city you have 1,300 vacant lots due to arson, due to people burning properties down, their own property down where African American residents would live, to then move to the suburbs where they know they could live in better conditions, because that was the moment where cities were having a lot of disinvestment, deindustrialization, and so people wanted to follow this movement of flight towards the suburbs. So Dudley has really been transformed. That's kind of the borders of the neighborhood for those of you who know Boston. So what is this environmental transformation that I'm talking about? And I will very briefly summarize this table here. It has three main aspects. The first one is related to environmental health and the ways that people have moved from illegal waste transfers depots, from contaminating factories to changing the use of the land, but also promoting cleaner business practices and really enhancing also the control that people have over the local businesses and the waste depot there. There is also much more access to environmental goods. So there are now 3 urban farms in Dudley of really big proportions, a greenhouse, a demonstration and education farm, 16 community gardens that are managed and owned by different minorities, some by Cape Verdeans, some by African Americans, some by Latinos. There's a farmer's market, there are locally owned groceries, there's a community orchard, a healthy bakery and cafe. So really an enhancement of healthy and affordable food options. There are new parks and green spaces, there are 3 new schoolyards, because schoolyards were also, like imagine playgrounds of schools, were also places where contractors from outside the city in the 80s would dump waste. And now they have been used as motor of environmental learning. There are community farms within the schools. There are also learning activities happening around English, around social studies. Like the farm is really a point of community formation. And there is also a lot of emphasis on healthy housing. So I'll move briefly through that. These are a few pictures, one of the urban farms, one of the new parks and playground, and then a farmer's market. So just to summarize in a graph, I would say that these type of actions really show that environmental justice cannot be separated from community development and vice versa. Community development cannot function, cannot progress without environmental justice considerations per se, which really shows the holistic environmental revitalization that has been happening on the ground in those variety of domains. So where does place come here? Why am I presenting all of this to you? Not just to give you a lot of detail and show that there are also good things happening in cities, no. It's because when you analyze the people's motivations and the way that they act, place is central. Place is a motor for action, and place is also a destination for people's work. So when you look at the rationale of people, of activists on the ground, you can see that people are very attached, first of all, to the residents that live in the neighborhood. It's been a neighborhood that has had a lot of immigrants, but also they've been there for 3 or 4 decades. They haven't moved out, and they have formed a very tight and cohesive community. People are also attached to the history of Dudley in a way, believe it or not, they are attached to the fact that it used to be a beautiful suburb of Boston in the middle of the 20th century. Then it was industrialized, then it was deindustrialized, and people are really connected to this history, to this path that Dudley has taken. They have a strong sense of belonging to also the landmarks that are still existing in the communities, to some of the factories that still have a chimney there, to some of the new projects that little by little have been promoted in the neighborhood, to also the fights. The fights themselves create bonds, and those bonds create new fights. And they also, of course, there's a place connection towards what I call environmental trauma, loss, and grief. And that's a concept, environmental trauma, that I've been developing in a book that will come out next year. The idea that those neighborhoods are not only traumatized because of the environmental bad determined by factories or refineries, but by long processes of decay and disinvestment. And in the book, I have a comparison with a neighborhood in Barcelona and a neighborhood in Havana to really show that oftentimes those neighborhoods are so stigmatized in their territory, in the activities that happen there, that they really feel a sense of loss and a sense of risk. And in Boston, it's very clear when you think about the arson that have happened for decades in the city, where people would hear the sirens at night of firemen coming and trying to extinguish a fire in their neighborhood. In Barcelona, for instance, there was also a lot of destruction in the city center when people and old-time residents talk about their trauma vis-a-vis those destructions. So these place connection and live experiences have provoked a form of community engagement around environmental projects, and they have been reinforced by what I call reinforcing motivators, which are a sense of responsibility towards each other, towards the neighborhood, a sense of personal growth that happens as we participate in the project, and also a commitment to the urban environment. And I'm not saying sustainability, I'm really saying to the urban environment. And as a result, the work that people have developed over the past 20 years have created a new form of place remaking and identity strengthening. And that's, I'm talking here about the context of cities, but I'm wondering for you all who work more in rural context, how that applies. And for some of the presentations I've seen yesterday, I think that it really does. The idea of environmental recovery and rootedness, that the land can be productive again, that the land can look welcoming, that the neighborhood can be livable again, and that people can be tied again to their traditions. So for instance, a lot of Cape Verdean immigrants now are developing community gardens that have food from Cape Verde. A lot of African Americans from the south of the United States are also developing food that are based on the produce that was cultivated in the farms where they used to work as children. And what I'm arguing also is that some of those projects are refugees and safe havens for communities because they protect the residents from outside influences, being either the stigmas that neighborhoods like Dudley's have had to live with. They also protect them from encroachment and from gentrification because they really mark borders between other neighborhoods like the South End in Boston. And as people, and I will show you some of the quotes, as people really make sense of their project, they really see a political goal there of also contesting urban developments in other parts of the city and really showing, this is my community garden, it marks the entry point to the neighborhood. It is a social and a physical border. It creates an urban village, it helps people celebrate their community, and it also creates a new form of identity and memory, which themselves create stronger place connections. It's kind of also a dialectic relationship. So just to summarize and move on. So what are my summary thoughts on place remaking in the city? The first one is that environmental contestation, as I was saying, is a response to decay to what activists perceived as an urban war on their territory and to environmental violence. And not necessarily environmental violence by the state, but also by the forms of decay and of practices that private property owners have produced in the neighborhood. It also addressed placelessness and fears of erasure from the neighborhood and the city, and protects residents from dominating practices. People now can have, again, positive media reports about their neighborhood. It's not about just the number of murders committed in Dudley in the past months, but it's also about the type of new initiatives that emerge there. It also helps overcome environmental trauma remaking place. And most importantly, I think that it really helps us unpack a little bit more the social dimensions of urban sustainability, if you want to go back to urban sustainability. Because we generally think about job creation, about social justice when you think about social equity, when you think about the social aspects of urban sustainability. But here what I'm arguing is that also we need to talk about the ideas of repair, trauma alleviation, nurturing, rootedness, and memory. And we need to think about that a lot when we plan a new development in cities, and possibly also in rural areas. So here are some quotes, for instance, about one of the new bakery and cafe that was created in Berlin. The creation of the Haley House was about giving people a place, a sanctuary, you know, and giving people a place to go. I think that is related to environmental justice in a very weird way. Why shouldn't everybody have a place to go where there would be a sense of possibility and community? There are not plenty of places that are nourishing. Nourishment, like on a lot of different levels, I think, is what I connect with the environmental justice. And also, I kind of inserted this slide after we decided to cover Georgos and Eric kind of triggered this debate about the political. I also think that there are really important fights that are beyond these place remaking and that actually are strengthening place remaking. The idea here is that as people develop, you know, reports, as people apply for funding, as people organize events in the neighborhood, as people participate in festivals that are supporting the different projects that they have on the ground, they also have broader political claims that they are very precisely putting forward, especially the ideas of stereotypes that have to do with racism, classism, and paternalism. That those neighborhoods need to be really taken over by the state because they are blighted, that they do not have anymore a chance for recovery. And here the idea is also that the right to the city, as a theory that you might have encountered in your urban geography courses, and also a right to the neighborhood, not to really shaping the space of the neighborhoods, the activities that happen there, and ensuring a sense of security and dignity for the residents. No more expulsions because the buildings are degraded. No more evictions. And in those fights, land control, land stewardship, what I mean by land stewardship is also people taking care of these new environmental spaces, the gardens, the parks, the playgrounds that they have created, and the construction of the physical, social, and symbolic borders with the community are central. They put forth a different form of democracy, which is a more direct and spontaneous and autonomous forms of democracy, and they also transgress general planning practices. As Mark Purcell talks about, he says that the right to the city also involves the reconstruction of a new form of democracy and the reconstructuring of their roots, of its roots. But here the roots for the residents are really building something autonomously, those spaces that are almost segregated, let's say, from the rest of the city, even though this has also dangers, as Maria was pointing yesterday. So some of the quotes around this. You are definitely breaking down stereotypes, says Alexandra King, who is a community organizer for the Food Project, which is a big urban farm in Dublin. And I think some of them are that people of color don't care about the communities that they are living in, that people of color do not care about their health. The director of the community organization for Alianza Hispana says, it is about social usefulness by adopting a progressive agenda of a more direct democracy with the communities managing to control their own community and not only delegating power and authority. However, there are challenges now for environmental justice activism and place remaking, which is the more recent research I've been doing in the past few months, I would say, on environmental gentrification. And it's also maybe a challenge. What would be the environmental gentrification of rural areas? Big question for you. So why is it important to think about environmental gentrification and what is it? I think it's because a lot of the environmental justice studies that are out there do not necessarily consider the broader political economy of urban environmental injustices, especially, I would say, sociology. So they look at the resistance movement, but they don't necessarily put it in a broader social metabolism of industrial economies, expansion of commodity frontiers, and also the social spatial processes that happen in cities, such as redlining. I don't know if you know what redlining is, but it is a practice that was undertaken for many years in the United States, where some insurance companies or lending institutions would not agree to fund or to cover some neighborhoods, and they would put a red dot on these neighborhoods saying, this is too dangerous, too blighty, this is a ghetto, this is the practice of redlining. So because of that, of course, some residents would move out of the city, and some would not have the possibility to move, so that created this social spatial segregation through the city. The other aspect of political economy of urban environmental justice has to do with the land. So the land as private appropriation, speculation, exploitation, what David Harvey has called uneven development due to cycles of investment, growth, devaluation, destruction, reinvestment, and I would also say mobilization. So now, the most important actually aspect of urban environmental justice mobilization is environmental gentrification, is to be protected for environmental gentrification. What do I mean by that, for those of you who might not be familiar with environmental gentrification? So for the past 5-6 years, there have been more and more studies coming out linking statistically the removal of waste sites or the cleaning up of the air or of the land to changes in the population of a certain neighborhood. So for instance, there is a study that shows that the cleanup of Superfund sites are sites that are funded by a Superfund from the Environmental Protection Agency in the US for cleanup and redevelopment. So when you clean up a Superfund site, this is related to up to 18% appreciation of housing values. There are other studies that have shown that neighborhoods that have had increases in air quality and in removal of ozone pollution have seen a 20 to 30 increase in the population of college graduates and middle-income residents. So you can see the relationship between environmental improvement and socio-economic change and population change in the neighborhood. So what is ecological gentrification? Most particularly, the quote is by Sarah Doolin, who is an anthropologist at Hunter in New York. It is the implementation of environmental planning agenda related to public green spaces that leads to the displacement or exclusion of the most economically vulnerable human populations while espousing an environmental economy. And in the end, what does it mean? It means that wealthier groups are able to move to centrally located neighborhoods that have been revitalized, that have benefited from sustainability planning, and they reap the benefits from that, while they indirectly push the bad stuff, the environmental burden, again, to more marginalized neighborhoods. So residents also who, for instance, have had the chance to live in a revitalized neighborhood, poor and minority residents, are starting to have to move out of the city. And why? Because there's this whole discourse about what are the benefits of city greening, for instance. And that started with Frederick Law Olmsted in the US about the importance of health, of aesthetics, of bringing people together with green spaces. And it continues. For instance, in the city of Portland, as Portland has redeveloped its waterfront, you see a picture up there, it has also developed narratives of restored ecologies and optimistic future along neighborhood livability initiatives, while just discreetly here and there preserving a few industrial details. And how does the process of greening happen? Sometimes greening precedes gentrification, which was the case of Seattle. You construct new parks and you make the environment more welcoming and new families moving. In other cases, like in Park Slope, Brooklyn in the 1980s, gentrification preceded greening. New residents came together and fundraised through foundation and also through the mayor, who was very supportive of that, the revitalization and the reconstruction of Park Slope. And sometimes those processes occur concurrently, and I talk about Jamaica Plain, which is my latest research, in a little bit. So what does it mean? It really means that environmental justice activism in cities has started to backfire at the activists, and it's really puzzling from an activism and from a strategies and tactics and framing standpoint. Oftentimes, the city-sponsored sustainability agenda are grounded in the successes of the environmental justice movement in their demands, and at times it uses their discourses and claims also as cities rebrand themselves. It has a lot to do, if you are familiar with this literature, on city rebranding. Cities want to be more modern, they want to be more competitive, they want to be more entrepreneurial, and sustainability now is a way to achieve this goal of rebranding. So under a seemingly neutral and technological approach of planning for greater urban sustainability, green plans and investments around them have the risk of further promoting traditional exclusion through urban renewal and urban redevelopment. And you see that, for instance, in the case of Detroit now. As you know, Detroit has had also a massive amount of vacant land in the past 5 years, and what has been done is that a few investors from all around the countries have come, supported by the municipalities, have bought immense amounts of land, transform them into an urban farm, in the idea that you will revitalize the neighborhood, increase the rent again of the neighborhood, increase the value, bring newcomers, and make the neighborhood flourish again. But then also forgetting that there will be, not forgetting on purpose, there will be patterns of exclusion through that. Medellin is the same case, a little bit differently. Medellin has proposed to build a green belt around the city, which will be the biggest green belt around the city in the world, except that this will also involve the dislocation of residents, and a lot of them marginalized residents who depend on farming and who also have been living there, and they've been excluded already from the mountains because of the armed conflict. So they've been finding refugees in this neighborhood, and now they are at the risk of being displaced by the green belt. But in this green belt construction process, some of the more richest neighborhoods that are also on the hill, there is no plan of removing them. They can stay. Those can stay and others cannot stay. So again, under the framework, the neutral framework of sustainability, a lot of exclusion, new forms of exclusion can happen. And if you go back to the case of New York, environmental justice organizations are really reflecting on this backlashing, backfiring of their activism. An organization called WeAct, which is based in the Bronx, was very involved in the PLAR NYC, which is New York City's sustainable development plan, and it demanded improved food options, public space, parks in the Bronx. But this has been reappropriated because as New York City has rebuilt some of the parks, they also have made new rules in which homeless people and residents of color cannot stay after a certain time, or some of the practices that are set of low-income residents cannot happen. For instance, there was a lot of drumming, there was a lot of cultural activities happening at night. Now this is banned. So this is really the exclusion of the space of the city through the rebuilding of the sustainability agenda, which means that organizations that we are really face the challenges of opening up new political spaces and repoliticizing the discourse of urban sustainability and re-engaging with municipal decision makers in ways that there really are more equal footage of decision making and participation. And there is already the recent adaptation of the environmental justice activism and gentrification. For instance, in 2006, the National Environmental Justice Advisory Council report was called Unintended Impacts of Redevelopment and Revitalization Efforts in 5 Environmental Justice Communities. This was the first documented evidence of the negative impacts of greening and revitalizing neighborhoods. For instance, also in the case of Brooklyn, there are long-time residents in a neighborhood called Newtown Creek that have decided that the way that the neighborhood will be revitalized will be by keeping the industrial uses of the neighborhood there, not necessarily just having a few chimneys, reminding residents that there was an industrial past there, but actually keeping this landscape in conjunction with some of the green initiatives, which they call Green Enough Initiative, rather than wiping out the whole landscape and having these beautiful new huge parks and green spaces that will not be for the benefit of the residents, and that will not preserve the attachment and the memory of residents to their place. So how is that illustrated in a quote, this adaptation of environmental justice activism to gentrification? So that was an interview that I did a few months ago with an organization in Boston. We realized very clearly at that time that if we improve the environment, if we actually clean up the air, we get good transit, if we get safe parks and green spaces, you know, all of the good environmental justice stuff, and we haven't done anything to address housing so that people can afford to stay, then we would only be exacerbating the displacement of lower income folks. And so that would be the ultimate tragedy, is that people fight to revitalize their neighborhoods, and then they cannot afford to stay, and they end up having to move to more marginalized areas that are less expensive, but don't have all the same things that they fought for. And so these organizations, which is also very strong, not only in community organizing but in advocacy, is really pushing for the rethinking in Boston of what is urban sustainability, and in ways that will address gentrification, encroachment, and affordability, and also addressing greening as a new urban frontier in a urban city. The case in point here, just very briefly, for instance, a conflict that has emerged very clearly around environmental gentrification is the case of Jamaica Plain in Boston, which is historically a Latino neighborhood. And in the place that you see now, the supermarket called Whole Foods Market, which some of you might know, it's a rather expensive, higher class supermarket that is generally labeled as healthy food option. This supermarket has been built in place of an old, huge Latino supermarket. And people are resisting that, and they are resisting the rebranding of their neighborhood. And as you can see in this real estate ad that I put on the right, now, you know, leaving the heart of JP, and in the end it also has a Whole Foods Market. So these new healthy food options that are more targeted to higher income, to white residents, are used as a way that real estate agents promote the city and try to foster the arrival of new residents in the neighborhood. So people not only protest green space in the neighborhood, they also protest businesses that have to do with healthy living, with livability, that they know might remove them little by little of their neighborhood because of something that's called the Whole Foods effect. So the Whole Foods effect is a series of studies by activists and also by academics that show that when a Whole Foods open in the neighborhood, within the next 5 to 10 years, the composition of the population changes and also the real estate prices increase. Anyway, so I'm concluding here. And the main argument that I want to push forward is the idea that LULUs, locally unwanted land uses, which are all of the type of land uses that communities of color and low-income residents have been fighting for, are not anymore as much toxic, but they're also green goods and green spaces. And in this little diagram here, which it's kind of a first attempt to put all of this together, so if you have any suggestions about how to improve it, I'm really happy. But it shows that at the beginning, let's say 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and still in many communities, so we have to also think about it as an ongoing process, green goods bags were toxic, vacant lots, contamination. These were then transformed or rebranded into brownfields, and there was funding around brownfields to change them and to clean up and regenerate the land, which also then later has been converted into green spaces. Some of this land generation has consisted into building new parks or community gardens. So that creates new environmental goods in the neighborhood, for sure. But that also creates opportunities and spaces for reinvestment, which also creates new spaces for changing in the composition of the neighborhood with gentrification and displacement, which then affects also how LULUs are conceived in neighborhoods of color and poor neighborhoods in the cities. So what are the questions and dilemmas for urban environmental justice? How can they adapt their activism to municipal plans that pour new resources dedicated to greening historically marginalized places? How do they react? Which type of alliances do they have to build to be able to really confront those decisions? how can they also confront discourses themselves, so the apolitical, post-political, technocratic discourse of sustainability, and reassert the social dimensions of the sustainability context. If they engage with public decision makers in the state, how can they ensure that they still represent and respond to their constituency, because this is also extremely difficult, the question of cooptation, movement cooptation. And finally, how can they prevent community dismantlement once revitalization has occurred, and what policies should they advocate for? So that's more questions in terms of activism. Now, if we think about questions for research, I would say that there is a lot more work that needs to be done from a qualitative and a quantitative standpoint on the real estate actors themselves. So in the field of urban real estate economics, for instance, but also in urban planning, in urban geography school. How do real estate actors respond to the transformation of the neighborhood from an environmental unjust place to an environmental good? What is their pervasive and continuous role in fostering green gentrification in a variety of ways? Who are they? How do they act? What type of advocacy and lobbying happens on the ground? Where greening was not followed by gentrification, which is kind of the counterpart. When greening was not followed by gentrification, what are the types of policies, planning, and resistance strategies that were in place to avoid displacement? Also, how do individual strategies and behavioral adaptation by local residents help address negative impacts of gentrification and mobilize others around them to enhance community resilience? How do people respond to that individually? Very difficult question too. How do local residents respond when greening and gentrification happens with other minorities in the city? How green gentrification is conceived when middle-class Black or Latino residents move into a revitalized neighborhood? That's a very difficult question. And finally, how do neo-rural residents, who are maybe the victims in a way of gentrification because they have to move out of the city, how do those neo-rural residents reshape the way that rural land is thought about and the conflicts that emerge from also new practices in rural areas? Finally, this is my two last slides, because I want to tie that back to this concept of environmentalism that we talked about earlier. Pass on that. So the three movements, and especially the last movement I've been talking about, in its relationship with the nature, wilderness, conservation mantra, and also the eco-efficiency. So far, there have been quite unsuccessful attempts to bring the three movements together. There's still been some separation, and it's difficult to find convergences. There are confluences, there are opportunities, especially between the conservationists concerned with biodiversity, loss and climate change, the popular epidemiologists who work on street science activism, the people who look at climate debt, ecological debt, urban squatters who preach autonomy, marginalized residents in cities who take action on their own, recyclers of urban waste, what we call degrowers in ICTA. So there are opportunities. The question is, how do we bring them together? And that's where I conclude then. There have been some collaboration over the years between the environmental justice movements in the US and other movements around the world, and some inspirations, influences. People like Robert Goddard, for instance, was very influential in Brazil. And there have been this defense of cosmopolitanism, environmental cosmopolitanism, people really fighting together for the same thing. But at the same time, not all of the local conflicts become global, and not all of the global conflicts become global. So how do we reunite them all together? Thank you very much.